Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Those of you coming in, come on in. We welcome those of you who are streaming with us. Glad you're here. If you would like to be on the mailing list so that you can know what's going on in this forum. We're not only having this very exciting day today, but we've got Cornell West coming. We just found out that Jane Goodall is coming. It's just a very exciting thing that we're going to be doing in this room. And if you want to be on that mailing list, please either call us or write us, or stop by, if you're in here, stop by the table with the red bags on it as you leave and fill out a welcome card. We always love for you to pledge to help us underwrite the expenses of this. So if you're not a pledging member of All Saints Church, please do so. We always have action table here. We put our faith into action today. We are focusing on voter rights. There's so much racist efforts to dismantle our Voting Rights Act, and so we want to make sure that we are standing just as organized and just as powerfully in response to it. It's a very special day. I love Nat Reed. Nat has come into our lives for a long time. He's been representing us in our publicity about the new building with the city, and then he and his wonderful wife Linda became members of All Saints Church, and then Zelda Kennedy comes to a meeting I'm in, and she says, we've got to have Nat Reed speak on Martin Luther King Sunday. So I'm giving her the great honor and privilege of introducing Nat. Will you please warmly welcome Zelda Kennedy?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and Ed is right. I had an opportunity to hear Nat's presentation that he's going to give this morning. And I have a friend of mine who says, I want you to love me through this. Because what that means, he's going to say something to me that I'm not going to like. So I want you to love me through this. When Nat came to me and said, Zelda, I'd like for you to please be a part of a presentation that I'm going to make. I would like for you to be in the audience. I said, so tell me, what is that presentation going to be on? And he said, it's going to be on Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, really, white boy? And I want you to know I went with a little trepidation. And when he finished his presentation, what I realized, and I'm going to quote this from the reading this morning, what I realized is all persons are interdependent. Whether we realize it or not, each of us live lives internally in the red. We are everlasting debtors to known and unknown men and women, black and white. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. The agony of the poor impoverishes the rich. The betterment of the poor enriches the rich. We are inevitably our brothers and sisters' keeper because we are our brother's brother and our sister's sister. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So I would love to present to you this morning Nat Reed and his I Have a Dream presentation.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any other city in the nation. Why direct action? Why the sit-ins, the marches, so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? Indeed, the very reason for direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. You call my activities untimely. Frankly, I've never been involved in a direct action campaign that was well-timed. In the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait almost always means never. We've come to see, in the words of one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We've waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights, but we creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a luncheon counter. Perhaps it is easy, if you've never felt the stinging darts of segregation, to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted, your speech contorted, when you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to a public amusement park that was just advertised on television, and you see tears well up in her eyes when told that Funland is closed to colored children, and you see the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and you see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. And when you're forced to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who asks, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? And when you take a cross-country drive and you are forced to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by the nagging signs of white and colored, when your wife and your mother are never accorded the respected title of Mrs., when your first name is nigger, your middle name is boy, regardless of your age, and your last name becomes John, when you are plagued with inner feelings of fear, outer feelings of resentment, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it so difficult to wait. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. Since we so diligently ask people to obey the Supreme Court's 1954 decision outlawing segregation in the public schools, at first glance it might seem somewhat paradoxical for us to ask people consciously to break laws. One might well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact there are two kinds of laws, just and unjust, and I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. Conversely, one has a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Let us hope that in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine forth over this great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours in the cause of peace and freedom, Martin Luther King, Jr., 16 April, 1963. That letter, written in the margins of newspapers and on scraps of toilet paper, smuggled out of the jail cell in the underwear of Robert Jones, his attorney, was in response to a full-page ad signed by 8 clergymen. And these were no ordinary clergymen. This was the religious leadership of the state of Alabama. 2 bishops of the Methodist Church, the auxiliary bishop of the Catholic Church, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church for the state, the minister of the large Baptist church, the rabbi of the synagogue, and just to make sure that their position was perfectly clear to the world, 2 bishops of the Episcopal Church. And what those words said, those high and lofty and so refined and polite words, what those translated to say was, Martin Luther King, you are a troublemaker, you are an outsider. We, the moral leadership of this state, will determine what its society's problems are. And we will decide when, if ever, to address them. Now get out of town. And the system that they were so ardently defending was one of institutionalized, legalized racism, in which almost half of the population had to use separate water fountains, separate and certainly not equal restrooms, couldn't sit down to eat in any restaurant in the South, had to go around to the screen door in back and ask politely for food. When paying full price for a set of clothes in a department store, could not try on those clothes lest some white person want to touch that same fabric. If injured in a traffic accident, lying on the pavement near death, could not be transported to the hospital in a regular ambulance. And I understood to my very core the message of those 8 men of the cloth. Because my own minister of the largest Presbyterian church in the South, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of the South, felt the same way. So did my mother and father. So did my aunts and uncles. So did every single adult I knew growing up in the South in the 40s and 50s. All of those adults had grandfathers who had fought in the Civil War on the southern side. And that war was in a long period of truce, but it was not over. And it would never be over. And I railed with every fiber of my body against a system that I considered so evil, so ingrained, so taken for granted, but I was one person. What could I do? But there was this preacher in the South who had written a letter from a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. And he was preaching in pulpits throughout the South, and he was saying, you know, if enough of us get together, they will have to listen. And when they listen, they will have to act. And when they act, things will change. And when things change, we shall overcome. And so I marched with Martin Luther King. Now, Martin Luther King was a liberal. No question about that. I was a conservative student. I was voting in my first presidential election around then, and I voted for Nixon, not for Kennedy. But this had nothing to do with liberal versus conservative. This had to do with common human decency. This had to do with my understanding of the teachings of Jesus that were being drummed into me in that Southern Sunday school. Martin Luther King was and is my hero. And I'm hoping that today, this tribute to him and the recitation of those eloquent words that he so skillfully wove on the loom of the English language have a new perspective coming from a white Republican face. As a conservative, I'm a conservative, but all of my heroes are liberal. And that's true of every conservative. And that's true of all of us in the room. Whoever we are, our heroes are liberal. Those guys, the guys that the conservatives so admire with the funny wigs and the funny clothes, our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, those guys, liberals, beyond liberal. They were radicals, bent on destruction, willing to kill, to overthrow a legitimate conservative government. Abraham Lincoln, upended an institution as old as our biological species. Socrates, Jesus. I mean, there was a liberal. Stood up against the religious and political establishment of his time. What if conservatives had gotten together in the mid-50s in a boardroom in New York and said, what are we going to do about the powder keg we're sitting on because of the likes of Stokely Carmichael and Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, who are luring people away from their allegiance to the country of their birth, luring them away from their religion to other religions, and urging retaliation, retribution, revenge. What if we could find a person within the black community who would find a peaceful way to resolve this, who would wrap himself in the red, white, and blue of patriotism and do this within the context of the majority religion of this country? He would be the conservatives' best hope. Of course, there was no such meeting, and conservatives at that time didn't feel that way at all. They thought that Martin Luther King was a troublemaker and he brought dissent, chaos, but as they look back today, he was truly the best friend that conservatives and all of us could have had. Those funny guys in the wigs and the costumes back then balanced their new republic on the pinhead of 5 words: all men are created equal. A concept so ethereal, so theoretical, so idealistic that although they ballyhooed it in their Declaration of Independence, when they began to write the operating manual for how the machinery would work, their Constitution, they found no place for it. And all of them died without seeing that ideal realized. And Abraham Lincoln, operating on the same continuum of equality, advanced the Founding Fathers' concept in the manumission of slaves. And 100 years after that, Martin Luther King, operating on the same continuum of equality, advanced the concept of equality to a level far beyond what any of those prior generations could imagine. And doesn't Martin Luther King deserve to be on that same high level of regard in America as those others? Does he not deserve his own day, even though he's the only person who has a full day of his own on the major calendar of holidays in this country? I think he does. I think he deserves to be up on the mountain. I have this fantasy that Caltech students with suitcases packed with chisels would climb to Mount Rushmore some night, and the world would go to sleep seeing Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. And in the morning when the sun came up, the glasses had been chipped off, the features had been changed, and it would be Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. What do you think? Now, I'm not starting a petition drive. I don't mean that literally. Don't sick the kooks on me. But metaphorically, is there anybody in this room who does not think that he deserves to be with Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Martin Luther King? Yes, yes. Okay. Was Martin Luther King a great man, or was he just a product of his time? There was a civil rights movement. Somebody had to lead it. He happened to be there. He's the guy. In the same way that there is always a general in charge of the U.S. Army, when a war comes, that person becomes an American legend. All of the other generals are never heard from. Was Martin Luther King like that? No, 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 no. Martin Luther King had a greatness that transcends his time and place and gives him a place in all of history as one of the greatest figures ever to live. In the 100 years between slavery and Martin Luther King, there was brutal there were brutal conditions in the South and the North. No black leader of that stature emerged. After he died, civil rights movement continued. Nobody replaced him there. He deserves that place. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress taking a bus home in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to get up and give her seat to a white man. She was arrested, and that night the leadership, the black leadership of the city, began to organize a boycott. And they called a minister who was new to town, a preacher just out of seminary, 26 years old, and asked Martin Luther King to join their movement. Some interesting things about that bus boycott that you may not know or may have forgotten. He didn't say yes. He wasn't sure it was a good idea. He wasn't sure that he wanted his name associated with that at first. We look back on him in history, leader, and then they asked him to be the leader. Not only do we want you to join our movement, we want you to lead it. And he wasn't sure he wanted to do that. Out of character from the Martin Luther King that we came to know. And you may be very surprised at what the demands of the black leadership and Martin Luther King were of the white establishment. They said, we don't want to disturb segregation. That's not what we're about. We don't even want to integrate buses and have people sit wherever they want. That's not our issue. Our issue is that once we sit down, we don't want to be asked to move. And that's what we're about, and that's why we're boycotting. And the white leadership said, boy, let me understand this. Let me explain in a way you understand. We don't give in to the likes of you. This is our system. We make the rules. You're going to follow every one of them. This is not a subject of negotiation. They dug in. So the black leadership dug in. They said, okay, we might as well escalate the demands if we're going to go to all the trouble of boycott. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened had those white leaders said, you know, it's not so unreasonable. It's a small thing. We could maybe give on that point. Martin Luther King would have gone back to his pulpit. Maybe the civil rights movement would have had to wait for a different person in a different time. Who knows? But it didn't. On August 28th, 1963, there was a march for jobs and justice on the Mall of Washington, D.C. Martin Luther King had helped organize that rally, and he knew from the very beginning that he wouldn't have time to look at even think about what he was going to say at the speech that he was supposed to deliver until right before that day. 12 hours before he was to go to that stage, got together with his staff and he reviewed a speech ghost-written for him by Stanley Levinson and Robert Jones, the guy who smuggled the letter out of the Birmingham jail. Those two wrote the speech. Staff got together. Staff didn't like it at all, argued throughout the night. Martin Luther King finally called off the debate. He says, I'm just going to take the speech in the other room and decide what to do. Thank you all for coming. That's the speech that was delivered to the press, and that's the speech that he took to the lectern. It was a wonderful speech. It was high and lofty. It was the kind of speech that is at a major event like that. And that's the speech he began to deliver. There was someone in the audience named Mahalia Jackson who had just sung to that audience, and she was sitting close to the front, and she became increasingly impatient with these high and lofty phrases because she had been to too many meetings with Martin Luther King where he had created electricity in the room. She didn't feel that. And when Martin Luther King paused between two words at exactly 9 minutes and 59 seconds into the speech, she yelled from where she was sitting, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And Martin Luther King paused for a total of 9 seconds while he shuffled the pages of the speech together, put them over to the side, and on the fly began to draw from this speech or that he had given this place or that. I'm not unmindful that many of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come here fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come here from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution, staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friends. And so, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day down in Mississippi, a state dripping with injustice, sweltering in oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racist, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, that one day, right down there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to hold hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, every rough place will be made plain, and every crooked place will be made straight, that the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. That is our hope, and that is the faith I go back to the South with. And with that faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With that faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With that faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America's to be a great nation, this must be true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California, but not only that. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, every state and every city, we will be speeding the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Thank you.
Anybody have any responses? As if standing ovation was not enough. I think I can do this. So Jean Fleming, you've got your hand up first.
Thank you so much for reminding us about the great leadership of Martin Luther King. Thank you, too, for mentioning one of my heroes, Rosa Parks, although you didn't use her name, but I guess you thought we all knew who you were speaking of.
You figured it out.
I figured it out. But I think she gave an impetus, really, to Dr. King when he found her seated in the bus. So, thank you.
Y'all notice how quick I am?
Thank you, Ed. I just finished a book about Freedom Summer that was led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And one thing that, because I wasn't alive in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, one thing I'm not clear about is how much the McCarthyism of the time and the labeling of MLK as a communist, how much that played into the white media and the white mindset about who MLK was.
In that era, the worst thing that you could call a person was a communist. It was a label bandied about. So it wasn't, it was two effects of the same cause. It was, if you wanted to tear a person down, you labeled them a communist. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover was making the claim that because Martin Luther King's staff contained top advisors who had indeed been active in the Young Communist Party or the Communist Party in the past, that Martin Luther King was. Martin Luther King was anti-communist. There was never a question about that. But the label came from pinning the worst tail that you could on the donkey, and that was communism.
Thank you. It was a great blessing to hear you go through that speech. I had one chance to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and, have that moment made alive. And I think for me, you just brought that moment alive in history again. The other thing I'd like to say is you call yourself a conservative. Could you please define conservative for me? I'm not quite sure I understand anymore.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that the labels of conservative and liberal are not destinations, they are directions. And they have no meaning except in comparison with something else. So to my liberal friends, I'm conservative. To my conservative friends, I'm liberal. And that's probably true of all of us. Those to the right of us view us as leftists, and those who are, on the far end of the spectrum on the other side say that this person is conservative. That's would be my answer to that. Yes.
Hi, I heard Martin Luther King speak in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not at Harvard, but at Ridge Tech High School. And he said something I've never forgotten. He said, Jesus taught us to love one another, but he didn't say we had to like one another.
Right here.
Okay, yes.
I was wondering if there's anything in Martin Luther King's writings that address what changed his mind about getting involved in the boycott.
He changed very quickly. This was just, it was a new idea to him. The activism, he couldn't get his arms around that quickly, but he was there. After he thought it over, he thought that, well, he just had to be there. And when they asked him to be the leader, I think he'd rather somebody else had taken it, but he very quickly decided to be the leader too. He may have. I've read all of his books, but it's been a while since I read that one, and I don't remember whether it's addressed in his book or not. I don't.
It is addressed in The Preacher King, and I cannot remember the author, but I have the book, and I'll be more than happy to share it with you. When I was in seminary, the author of The Preacher King came and spoke with us, and yes, it was addressed in that book. I want to say that and Nat, thank you so much. You really. I can't begin to say how I felt when you finished your presentation. Primarily because I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. through the voice of a white male. And it was life-changing for me because of how I felt about Martin Luther King Jr. And for you to take on that responsibility, for you to dedicate yourself to this was more than impressive to me, because a lot of black folks would have said, really? What are you doing? I was one of them. So
You never told me at the time that you had any second thoughts.
I didn't, because that's not who I am. I am open to seeing, I am open to being, and when you asked me to come and hear your presentation, I was open to it. I was open with a lot of skepticism. However, I really want you to know how much I appreciate this.
Thank you.
And that is the reason why I invited you here today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.